We want to begin this morning by completing our discussion of Esther. Last time we had come to the purpose of the book and saw that the purpose of Esther was to show us that while the physical seed of Abraham was not faithful to Yahweh, they were still protected by God from Gentile attack. And we have to move, after understanding the purpose, to the literary structure. And I want to really present two ways in which the structure of Esther is understood today. I've given you a chart that helps you to appreciate the structure of Esther as seen reflected within the MacArthur Study Bible. That this structure sees Esther divided into three major divisions. And we talked about the aspect of human reversal that is seen within the book. Well, you'll notice that I have reworked the main headings of the three sections, the three divisions of Esther, to reflect the reversal. So in 1:1 to 2:18, you have a movement from Vashti to Esther as far as who is the queen of Persia. Vashti is disposed. Esther is established then into that position. Beginning in 2:19 to 7:10, we have a movement from Haman to Mordecai. That at the end of Esther chapter 2, that we are stated reintroduced to Mordecai and Mordecai's learning of a plot against King Ahasuerus, and that plot that has a very important role to play within the book. And then with Mordecai's benefit to the king, we're then introduced in chapter 3 to Haman, who was functioning as the prime minister, who was functioning in the second in command within the Persian Empire. And we see his determination in chapter 3 to destroy the Jews. And yet at the end of chapter 7, we find out that it is Haman who is put to death. And so we move from Haman to Mordecai. And then in chapter 8, we are reminded of the calamity that is going to come upon the Jews. And yet how another decree is issued and that is reversed. And ultimately, in chapter 10, we see that Mordecai, and the very last statement of the book, was one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. And so we move from the calamity, which had been determined for Israel, to the good that was going to come to the Jews. Now, why would we see these three divisions? Well, each one of these divisions is based upon the issuing of a royal edict. 3 edicts are issued according to the text of Esther. The first one is at the end of chapter 1, with Vashti's attitude of non-submission to Ahasuerus. He asked his counselors what is to be done because of that conduct. And they're concerned because if her conduct becomes known to all the women within the empire, they will respond with the same kind of disobedience, lack of submission, lack of respect to their husbands that has been seen in Vashti's conduct. So in Esther 1:19, we read, "If it please the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti should no more come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her her royal position to another, who is more worthy than she. And when the king's edict which he shall make is heard throughout his kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small." And so this word pleased the king. The edict is issued. And then, of course, in chapter 2, the king realizes, well, his queen has been removed. And so he asks advice, and this is where the beauty contest is arranged for Ahasuerus to select a new queen. And so the edict that is issued, and the circumstances leading up to it at the end of chapter 1 then determine the course of events that takes place in chapter 2. Interestingly, in this first division of the book, along with this edict, we have before it and after it 2 feasts. We have the great feast that Ahasuerus has, where he was displaying for his attendants, princes, officers, princes of the provinces, his riches, of his glory and his splendor. It was in that context that he wanted Vashti to make an appearance before these leaders of the Persian Empire that she refuses. So it was at a feast, at a banquet. And then at the end of chapter 2, with the determination that Esther was to be the queen in 2:18, the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his princes and his servants. He also made a holiday for the provinces and gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So we have an edict and we have 2 feasts recorded within the narrative. Then in 2:19 to 7:10, again we have an edict that is issued because of Haman's response to Mordecai and to his people. 3:8, Haman says to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry out the king's business to put into the king's treasuries." And so the king takes his signet ring, gives it to Haman, and Haman is able to issue the decree, the edict, in the name of the king. And in verse 14, a copy of the edict will be issued as law in every province. It was published to all the people so that they should be ready for this day, a day that had been determined by lot when the Jews would be destroyed as a people within the Persian Empire. We need to remember that basically all of the Jews at that time lived under the authority of the Persians during the time of Ahasuerus, during the time of Xerxes, that this would really be death to the Jewish nation, to the Jewish race. The response, and we have 2 feasts. This is where Esther stands in the gap and seeks to act for the welfare of her people. We have a feast given in chapter 5. We have a second feast that we see at the end of chapter 6 and at the beginning of chapter 7. So within this middle division of the book, an edict and 2 more feasts. And it's because of the edict that Esther has to act in the way that she does and to have these 2 further feasts. Then in chapter 8 through 10, since the edicts of the Persian kings could not be nullified, another decree is issued in chapter 8, verses 3 to 14. We see the king recognizing that he had issued the first decree as Esther comes and speaks to him. And so another decree has to be issued, and this is the decree that allows the Jews to fight back against their enemies. And any who would fight against Israel, the Jews had the authority from the king to kill their enemies and to go after their enemies. And so in chapter 8, verse 13, a copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all the people, so that the Jews should be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. And that decree also is then taken throughout the Persian Empire. When the Jews received the decree, there was gladness and joy, a feast, and a holiday. And so when they hear of the edict, there is a feast. And then when the historical events take place in the 12th month, and Israel is able to avenge themselves of their enemies, beginning in chapter 9, verse 17 through 19, and again in verse 22, that there was to be a continual feast, Purim, that was to be established, because Israel was able to rid themselves of the enemies against them. And so there was a feast of rejoicing and feeding, a holiday for rejoicing and feasting, the sending of portions of food to one another, 9:19. And then this was to become an annual event as far as we see toward the end of chapter 9. And this leads into the continuing feast of Purim that continues to be observed by the Jews even to this day. So there is 3 edicts and 6 feasts that are narrated within the book of Esther, and these correspond to the 3 great movements of reversal that is seen within the book. And so it is with this structure that the outline in the MacArthur Study Bible reflects. It reflects this basic 3-part structure of the book. However, and so I've also given for you another approach that has been taken to the structure of Esther. And this comes from the article in Giving the Sense, and is reflective of the outline that is in Bush's commentary. And this sees also the concept of reversal, but sees Esther, as you can focus in on the chart, that the turning points, the major reversal within the book is in chapter 6 verses 1 to 11. This is the night that Ahasuerus is not able to sleep. It is the night after the first banquet that has been held with Esther and Haman. And Mordecai could not sleep, and so he has the Chronicles read to him. And as the Chronicles are read to seek to put Ahasuerus to sleep, it just happens that the pages are turned to the incident where Haman had warned of the plot against the king's life. And so the king asks him in verse 3, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's attendants have to say nothing. There's nothing in the annals that says that Mordecai was ever rewarded for his deed of saving the king's life. And at that point, so it just so happened the king couldn't sleep. It just so happened they turned to the record of Mordecai's report. And it just so happens when Ahasuerus wants to honor Mordecai, Haman comes into the court. And he comes to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which had been prepared for Mordecai's death. Yet, on the mind of the king is the determination to honor Mordecai. And so the king asks him in verse 6, what is to be done for a man whom the king desires to honor? And here only within the book of Esther, the author gives you the thinking of a character. And Haman said to himself, we're giving insight into the motivation from which Haman's answer will come. Whom would the king desire to honor more than me? And so he gives his statement because he thinks that the king wants to honor him, to bring forth the royal robe. Let the horse on which the king is ridden, on whose head the royal crown has been placed. Let the robe and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead the man through the city square and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor. And Ahasuerus says, good, go and do that, Haman, for Mordecai. And it's at this point in chapter 6, verses 12 to 14, that Haman's wife and advisors predict his downfall before Mordecai. So that Haman had boasted after the banquet of the fact that he was going to have Mordecai hanged. But at the end of chapter 6, these same people say, Haman, your fall has begun. And so we see here the centerpiece of the book. And speaking about reversal, how you will then notice that before and after this pivot point, we have the same elements and yet always reversed. Notice AB becomes BA. And so this is trying to show that from this centerpiece, as you see all the events leading up to chapter 5:9, we have the prologue where we see a Persian festival and ascension of Esther. And then we see the major complication of the book, the Jews endangered by their archenemy. And so we have the response of Mordecai giving his strategic appeal to Esther to intervene. And we see the developments that takes place through Esther's first banquet, all leading up to the centerpiece of the book. And then after, balancing out the above, we have Esther's second banquet. We have a second appeal from Mordecai to resolve the problem that had come before us with the first edict that leads to the issuing of the second edict. So rather than the Jews being endangered, the Jews were victorious over their enemies, and that in the epilogue there is the Jewish festival and ascension of Mordecai that echoes the festival and the ascension of Esther that is seen in the beginning of the book. Now I give this second structure to you, that you should be aware of this. This has developed over the last generation of studies on Esther, and you will see that in journal articles and commentaries during the last 20 to 25 years that there is usually some element of this kind of chiastic structure that is now seen to be the basic structure of the book of Esther. Now, whether we can be this precise, there is a debate to that, but certainly we see the theme of human reversal, and what this structure certainly enhances is the fact that throughout the total narrative of the book, the whole structure of the book is based upon this reversal theme that is seen within the structure as well. Now, in giving you that structure, I've already stated that this structure, this chiastic structure, is found recorded in the major exegetical commentary that is available on Esther today. That is the work by Bush in the Word Biblical Commentary series. And Bush is an outstanding commentary. It takes into account the traditional and contemporary discussions on the book of Esther. It is very, very complete in its exegetical discussion, and is well worth having as a foundational work on the book of Esther, and his work on Ruth is very good as well. I've listed 3 works for you as far as English interpretation of the book of Esther. None of these works would I say is a final culminating work. This is the one to have. They're all good basic texts. The work by Baldwin in the Tyndale Old Testament commentary series, Joyce Baldwin. The work by John Whitcomb in the Every Man Bible's commentary. That is not expositors. This is Every Man's Bible commentary. It's a paperback, still available, by John Whitcomb. And then the work by Brenneman in the NAC as a satisfactory work on the book of Esther, along with Ezra and Nehemiah. And then a very excellent expositional work by Davis. This is a different Davis than Dale Davis, but in the same series, God Behind the Scene. And this exposition sees God as the hero of the text, providing for the well-being of his people, though his people were not recognizing him through their actions in the book of Esther. And since this has already been brought up, I would see this as the purpose of the book. Then I think Davis gives us a good pattern to follow as far as preaching the book of Esther. Now let's think in terms of two major interpretive issues of the book of Esther. The first is an issue between the orthodox approach to the book and the more liberal approach to the book of Esther. In the last 100+ years in critical work on Esther, there has arisen skepticism concerning the historical details within the book. And until a generation ago, you can look at the critical commentaries from the end of the 19th century through to approximately 1970, and you will see that liberal commentators on Esther view the genre, view the form of the book of Esther as being complete fiction. They see this book as either parable or allegory, that it is either telling a very interesting fictional story as a parable about the fact of how God is taking care of his people during the post-exilic period. They bring this up because they say that there are certain aspects within the book that just strain historical credibility. They bring up the improbable details, the 6 months of feasting that is referred to in chapter 1, verse 4. The fact that this great feast took place for 180 days. The second thing, the year-long beauty preparation for Esther before she goes into Ahasuerus. The heights of the gallows that were constructed by Haman. These gallows that we see in chapter 5, verse 14, that 50 cubits high, at least 75 feet high, if not higher. Might have been actually following the royal cubits of Persia, which would have made it even higher than the regular cubit that is spoken about in the Old Testament. The great number of men who were killed, according to chapter 9, verse 16, that when the Jews were able to kill their enemies, the fact that they killed 75,000 of those that hate them, and that we have no record of that kind of a civil war resulting in those kinds of deaths, as far as the Persian records are concerned. Now, those are just improbable. That's just argument from silence. But then they will move toward there are statements within the book that are just plain contradictory. That when we read Herodotus, the great Greek historian, who writes approximately a generation after the events that are taking place here, he speaks of the queen of Xerxes being a mistress. And there is no indication that Xerxes had more than one official queen as we read Herodotus' history. He brings up the fact that there were many, many concubines, but only one queen as far as Xerxes' official wife was concerned. It's also recorded within the Persian records that there were 20 satrapies of the Persian Empire. Not the 127 provinces that are mentioned in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Well, how do we answer these? And conservative commentators for the last 100 years have answered the attacks, and certainly the improbable details are really a matter of silence. It has been disputed upon whether the text in 1:4 is really saying that the banquet itself lasted for 180 days. The text might be speaking about a 180-day period where the planning and preparation for the invasion of Greece was taking place, and the fact that the banquet itself in verse 5 was a banquet lasting 7 days for all of the people who were present. And it could be that he gathers together, as you hear us, his leaders, and they have a banquet. They do their planning, and then there is this great feast that takes place at the end. And it might be that the officials rotated from their posts for a period of approximately 6 months of time. That is one of the explanations that's been given for this 180 days of feasting. Well, the text doesn't clearly say the 180 days were devoted every day to feasting. As far as the year-long beauty pageant is concerned, well, the king was demanding that the women come to him with their beauty, and we know today this might not be impossible for them to have spent approximately a year preparing these women for the queen. The height of the gallows, again, could be very, very possible that Haman would build something this big and this grandiose. And certainly, not only Haman and his family, but throughout the Persian Empire, they were enemies, and so the numbers should not be viewed as necessarily impossible. When it comes to Xerxes' wife, Herodotus might not have given us a complete picture. And the satrapies were divided into provinces. We know that Judea was a province of the satrapy, the greater province beyond the river at the time of the Persian Empire, reflected within the post-exilic records. So as more and more information is being found within the Persian documents, do we have improbable and contradictory details within the book of Esther? And today it is agreed by both conservatives and liberals that really this extra biblical material in the end is really a stalemate. That if you want to be a skeptic, and if you want to see contradictions, then that's what you'll see. But the fact that there is nothing improbable or impossible that is mentioned within the book, and even within the last generation, liberals themselves have reread the book of Esther and said that there is a lot of Persian color that is reflected within the book. So that within contemporary liberalism there has been a movement away from saying that the book is complete fiction. It is some kind of fictional parable or allegory, to say that it's a historical novel. It is a story written in a style that would be familiar to the Jews who lived among the Persians, and actually the writing could have been after the Persian Empire and into the Greek time period when the development of a story which would have historical elements within it would be known. So some argue from a Persian milieu, some argue from a Greek milieu, but would say that, okay, there are historical colorings, cultural colorings that reflect the time of Xerxes seen within the book of Esther. But it's still a novel. Esther really did not exist as a historical person, nor Mordecai, though Xerxes did. And the story is told with this cultural coloring to encourage Israel with the fact that they would not be destroyed as a people. But it's just a great story. It's a historical novel. Now, what would lead us against seeing it as a historical novel is the fact that the Israelites rejected the Greek ideas of bringing forth that which might be fictional. And in fact, the best way to understand the book has historical narrative. That since this is a book which becomes part of the Jewish canon, it shows us that the Jews accepted it as historical narrative. If they thought that it was complete fiction, or that in some way it was a fictionalized novel approach, they would have rejected it outright. And along with that, we see within the text some very, very definite indications that this is historical narrative. The book begins with the Vav consecutive, and it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. Now it came to pass in the days, now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. That way to begin the book is a tip-off that the author is assuming this book is going to be read as historical narrative. We see throughout the book the different chronological references, and I have listed the verses for you there so you can look through the book and see that he is anchoring, the author is anchoring the book in space-time. This happened at certain times, and he speaks very definitely of that timing. And also, he states that what he is saying within the book is verified by historical sources, not that we have today, but sources that the original hearers of the book could check. 223. They were both hanged on a gallows, as it is written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. This chronicle that Ahasuerus has records not only the plot, but also the fact that the two men were put to death. The fact that there was a chronicle that was read to the king. The book of the records, the Chronicles. And then in chapter 10, verse 2, If you want to check out more about Mordecai, says the author, a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? Right, if you want to check out more of the historical record, you can find it in the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. And what the author shows is not only that this took place at very definite times, very definite places, but there is an extra biblical record available at the time when the book was written to verify the historical events and even give a greater record concerning Mordecai in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. So why would he invite a search of the historical records if the historical records did not exist? So there is enough evidence for those of us who believe in the inerrancy of Scripture to know and to have confirmed to us that Esther is historical narrative. Esther, Mordecai were real people who lived during the time of Xerxes, and the events recorded within this book are not fiction, are not a novel, but is a true historical narrative. But the greater issue among those who accept the inerrancy of the book is how do we understand Mordecai and Esther? And the Orthodox approach traditionally has been to see them as spiritual Jews. That even though they do not mention the name of Yahweh, though we do not see them praying, though we don't see them in any way responding to Torah, that nevertheless we are to appreciate the fact that they are spiritual. A contraposition is the fact that the author shows them to be unspiritual. The very fact that Mordecai would allow his niece to be put into the king's court, the fact that she would have a sexual relationship with the king, though stated very discreetly in Esther chapter 2, and the fact that she would be taken and returned after that evening to the concubines after that evening shows the fact that this was against Torah. And so Mordecai and Esther are brought before us within the text at the very beginning as Jews who were willing to be involved in Gentile practices, unlike Daniel and his 3 friends in Daniel chapter 1, that were unwilling to disobey Torah, to participate within the Gentile practices, that Mordecai and Esther do not have these same reservations, and so they are brought before us by the author, and nothing within the book past this point would give us any indication that they are anything other than unspiritual Jews. Mordecai has a great desire for his people, but nothing is said within the text as far as having a great passion for the God of Israel. Bush says there's elements within the book that show them to be both spiritual and unspiritual. Their knowledge of Israel, the implication of their knowledge of the promises that God had given to Israel. When Mordecai says in chapter 4, verse 13, to Esther, do not imagine that you in the king's presence can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at the time, relief and deliverance will arise from the Jews from another place. Right, where did he get that faith? Well, he got that faith based upon the understanding of the Abrahamic covenants. Yet, chapter 2 certainly does introduce us to Mordecai and Esther as following the ways of the Gentiles. And so, Bush says as you go through the book, there are elements that would say that there are spiritual other places where they're characterized as unspiritual, that both are true. But at the end of the day, I think we have to agree with Dr. MacArthur in the Study Bible to say that really the true spiritual nature of Mordecai and Esther is unknown. As he says on page 682 of the Study Bible, his conclusion, so this issue must ultimately be resolved by God, since he alone knows human hearts. We do not have enough information in the book of Esther to make any kind of spiritual judgments as far as Esther and Mordecai are concerned. Whether they will be resurrected to be part of millennial glory, or whether their ultimate lot is the lake of fire. Really, the book of Esther does not give us the information necessary to make that determination. All we can say, going along with Whitcomb and Davis, is that the author of Esther pictures Mordecai and Esther basically as being unspiritual Jews, because that fits into the context of what he is seeking to communicate. He is trying to show that, by and large, Israel, in the dispersion from the end of the Babylonian captivity until the establishment of the kingdom, like Mordecai and Esther, though proud of their ancestry and having some remembrance of what God had communicated to the patriarchs and to his people, by and large live as Gentiles among the Gentiles. And that they have, though having a historical remembrance, are not practicing and following Torah. And yet God comes to the aid of his people, even within that condition. And so they are pictured within the book, characterized in this way because of what the author is seeking to communicate. And at the end of the day, we do not know what their ultimate spiritual condition was. That is reserved for God and God alone. Now, with that understanding, as we come to the preaching of Esther, I, for one, cannot preach Mordecai and Esther as godly examples who are to be emulated. I don't believe, at the end of the day, that is the reason Esther is in the canon. I don't believe that it is there to give us a spiritual example through these two individuals. Therefore, like Davis, I would preach it as how God, in remembrance of his promises to the patriarchs, is reversing and using the human events recorded within the book to show ultimately that no matter the spiritual condition of his people, that he is still working for their well-being, for their protection, for their deliverance during the time of the Gentiles. That ultimately I will preach Esther as showing us the sovereign hand of God, continuing to act in accordance with Genesis 12:3 and the Abrahamic covenants, no matter what the spiritual condition of his people is during the time of the Gentiles. If you want to preach it as is usually preached, as Esther and Mordecai being models of spirituality, then you'll have to come to the conviction that that is the way in which the book of Esther is portraying these two individuals. If, like me, you can't come to that conclusion, I would recommend you do preach Esther, but preach it as showing the providential care of God for his people. And it is from that perspective, and using Davis as a model and a guide, that I would challenge you to preach the book of Esther. All right, in the Masoretic text, the Masoretic text only includes what we have within our New American Standard, New King James versions today of Ezra, Nehemiah, the Old Testament book of Ezra, the Old Testament book of Nehemiah. But there is a further work, a Greek work, that contains 2 Chronicles 35-36, along with Ezra and Nehemiah 8, 1-12, placed in different order, plus a post-exilic account that is not within the Old Testament, and this was combined together and known as First Esdras. There's a second work, an apocalyptic work, in Greek, but now only extant within the Latin text, known as Second Esdras. Now, as is brought out, that when the original King James was translated, because, as you can see, the Vulgate includes each one of these books, Ezra, Nehemiah being First Esdras, and then Second Esdras, and within the Vulgate was a translation of what was First Esdras known as Third Esdras, and Second Esdras known as Fourth Esdras, that the early traditions, the RSV seeking to be an ecumenical translation, that these translations were made by the translators as well. And in the earliest King James, from 1611 to the end of the 17th century, they were included, and then they dropped out. And then the Septuagint has Esdras A, and then refers to Ezra Nehemiah as Esdras B. Both are found within the Septuagint. But you will note, even in the Septuagint, what we call two distinct books of Ezra and Nehemiah is one book, Esdras B. All right, so taking a look at the textual tradition that has come to us, the MT is clear. There is one book named Ezra and Nehemiah. In the Septuagint, there is one book known as Esdras B that follows a both shortened and elongated version of some of the same events, known as Ezra A. The Vulgate does divide the books into First and Second Ezra, and the English translation following the Vulgate in that division has come to us, so that we have the distinct book of Ezra and the distinct book of Nehemiah within our English tradition. But that's a place where our English tradition does not well reflect the Masoretic tradition. And you've probably picked up at this point, I tend to follow the Masoretic tradition. And so that is why your chapter titles are one and the same, because you got to follow, Ezra and Nehemiah within the text. Or I guess you could make Nehemiah 1, Ezra, Nehemiah 11, and go through chapter 23. But why, when it comes to themes and purpose, it is one book. You go back and review and read Ezra, Nehemiah as a unit. So just as 1st and 2nd Samuel are one literary unit, 1st and 2nd Kings was one literary unit, the Torah was one literary unit, Ezra, Nehemiah is one literary unit. Now there is an implication of that for preaching. Don't preach half the book. And don't start in the middle of the book. So for those of you who have a series already ready to go on Nehemiah, think about adding Ezra to the presentation. I mean, would you start halfway through Romans? Think about that. All right, well, Ezra and Nehemiah, one work. And the dating of the events. The dating of the events is from the decree of Cyrus. Ezra 1 begins in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation about all of his kingdom. And there's the proclamation given in verses 2 through 4, and that is, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth. He has appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all of his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of Yahweh, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And every survivor, whatever place he may live, let the men of that place support him with silver and gold, with goods and cattle, together with a freewill offering for the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And if you don't go, if you don't follow the edict and go to Jerusalem, then you help those who do through your offerings, that they would go to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple there. So the events begin in, and this can be precisely dated, 538 BC. But the events at the end of the book cannot be precisely dated. For when we come to Nehemiah chapter 13, Nehemiah tells us what was taking place in Jerusalem, but in 13:6 he says, "But during all this time I was not in Jerusalem. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. I returned back 12 years after I had come to go back to the king." So around 432 BC, he returns from Judah, from Jerusalem, and goes back to Artaxerxes. And then he uses that phrase that drives chronologists up the wall. After some time, I asked leave of the king and came to Jerusalem and learned what was taking place and dealt with it, which is the rest of chapter 13. And it's almost at that point, Nehemiah, tell us how long? Not after some time, I returned for a second governorship. And so that's why all we can do is put a question mark. Probably the earliest would be around 430 BC. On some of the other charts I've given to you, I just take a round date of around 425 BC. He goes back for some time. Is that a year? Is that 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? It's certainly not a millennium, but it's sometime later. He comes back, and that's where the final events of the book take place. Now, where does Ezra and Nehemiah fit within the Masoretic tradition? We talked about it's one book. Where? Where do we find Ezra and Nehemiah? We find Ezra and Nehemiah after Daniel and before Chronicles. And it is therefore significant in the Masoretic tradition. Ezra begins with the decree of Cyrus. Chronicles will end with the decree of Cyrus. So now as you read Ezra and Nehemiah and then go right into Chronicles, you've got an inclusio from the beginning of Esther, Nehemiah, to the end of the book of Chronicles. Does that mean that they are to be read together? Does it mean that the chronicler is also the one who wrote Ezra and Nehemiah? There has been tremendous debate and continues to be tremendous debate over that, and we only have to say we really don't know. Now, what I have done is given you a chart that gives you some idea of the correlation of Ezra and Nehemiah. Sorry about that. I know you're going crazy as I try to zero in on this. The correlation of Ezra and Nehemiah seen within the book that went before and the book that comes after. It is very interesting that as you read Daniel, that Daniel, by and large, gives a historical introduction for Ezra and Nehemiah. For within the first six chapters of Daniel, Daniel speaks about how the time of the Gentiles begins, assumed, implied, with the taking of the first captives to Babylon in 605 BC. Daniel and his three compatriots being among those who were taken. And in the history, Daniel lives all the way through the Babylonian period from 605 BC to the collapse of Babylon in 639 BC. By that point, after Nebuchadnezzar's death, he had gone into retirement. He was brought out of retirement on the very night in which the Babylonian Empire collapsed, Daniel chapter 5. And then we see him being given a position of governmental authority in the early stage of the Persian Empire in Daniel chapter 6. Then he is allowed, and already begun in Daniel chapter 2 during the time of Nebuchadnezzar, and then we have visions that were given during the time of the Babylonian into the early years of the Persian Empire, where Daniel is allowed, based upon that history, to look ahead and realize what began with Babylon would culminate with a kingdom that would flow out of historical Rome. And we'll put all that back until we get to the end of 502. But, all right, Babylon, Persia, to Greece, to Rome, to a reconstitution of Rome that will be destroyed, that the kingdoms of the Gentiles, beginning with Babylon, will continue on until God's kingdom is established. And this is all written down in 535 BC. So that from Babylon to Rome is a time of Gentile authority over Israel, a God-ordained authority over Israel. So that basically decrees are issued that will determine the fate of Israel during this time. Decrees issued by the Gentile kings. And in fact, Daniel 9, 10, 11 makes it very, very clear that during this time, Israel's history will be subsumed under the greater history of what God is doing among the Gentiles. It is exactly this perspective that is given to us in Daniel, which is seen in Ezra and Nehemiah, that takes the slice of Persia and goes back and fills in the details of the Jewish relationship with the Persian kings, beginning with Cyrus in 538 BC, as we've seen, through Ahasuerus, somewhere between 430 to 425 BC. Now, the early chapters of Ezra begin with Cyrus and actually will point us all the way into Ahasuerus' reign. And then beginning with Ezra 7 to Nehemiah 13, all of the events will take place during the reign of that Persian king. Then taking us to about 425 BC, Chronicles will then say, all right, those who find themselves under Gentile dominion in Israel, post-exilic, now let me tell you what took place, almost a mini Old Testament, as we'll see as we get to Chronicles, beginning with creation and coming all the way through the decree of Cyrus, lessons from Israel's history to guide Israel under the Persians. And of course, as Daniel has already directed, the same kind of affairs that will continue on from Greece and to Rome and ultimately to the establishment of God's kingdom. How the godly in Israel should be faithful to the worship of God and to hope in the fulfillment of the Davidic covenants. So this is where Ezra and Nehemiah fits in. It is read after you have read Daniel, so you understand what has taken place and what will take place. And here is Ezra, Nehemiah, dealing with this post-exilic period, Babylon having been destroyed, Persia taking it over, and now we see the initial history of the Jews under the Persian time period. All right, and so that shows us the canonical connection. So if you were reading the Masoretic text, I should go this far. If you were reading the Bible in the same order as Jesus and the disciples, you would read Daniel, then you would read Ezra, Nehemiah. All right, so that's where it is within the Old Testament canonical tradition. Two literary observations. First-person sections in Ezra and Nehemiah. So you are reading along. You're reading the historical events given to us, and interestingly, even you have the decree that is issued and is placed within the book. And in fact, that is something that is true about Ezra and Nehemiah, that when edicts are made by the Persian kings, when letters are sent back and forth, the author, the final compiler author, has no reservation at that point of just dumping the edict or the letter right into the record. It doesn't make for the most exciting reading as you're going through Ezra and Nehemiah, that all of a sudden I got to read the edict of the king that was given, or a letter is sent. All right, and we'll come to this on Wednesday in the interpretive issues. We have to deal with, and he didn't put the exact letter from that time. He jumped ahead to a further letter that can show the continuing hostility of the enemies within the land. But we'll deal with that on Wednesday. But you finally are reading along, and you've been reading the narrative, the third person, and you come to the end of Ezra chapter 7, and Ezra says in verse 28, "Thus I was strengthened according to the hand of the Lord my God upon me, and I gathered leading men from Israel to go up with me." Now, does that assume the final writer is Ezra? Well, no, because after having these first-person sections in Ezra, all of a sudden you come to Nehemiah. And begin with the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Verse 4, now it came about when I heard these words, I sat down and wept. Right? Does that make the author of Ezra, Nehemiah, Nehemiah? You got two eyes fighting for authorship here. Or do we have a third individual who is just, because we've seen that this is part of his style, just to, at certain points within the narrative, take the decree, take the letter, take the memoir, and just put it into the narrative. And we have these first-person sections. We also have two sections in Ezra of Aramaic. So that in chapter 4, verse 8, well, in verse 7, he says, the text of the letter written in Aramaic and translated from Aramaic, that should tip you off. Verse 8 and following is in Aramaic. But even when the letter ends, the Aramaic doesn't. So in verse 23, as soon as the copy of King Artaxerxes' document was read, this is in Aramaic as well, and he continues to give narrative all the way through the rebuilding of the temple, all the way through chapter 6, verse 18 in Aramaic. Then he starts talking about the exiles observing the Passover, reverts back to Hebrew. And then again in chapter 7, verses 12 to 26, when he gives Artaxerxes' decree, once again, he gives it in Aramaic, which obviously assumes that his audience is bilingual, that they can understand both the Hebrew and the Aramaic within the text. All right, now what are the major themes that emerge as you read Ezra, Nehemiah as a whole? Well, consistently throughout the book, particularly when Gentiles refer to Israel's God, they refer to him as the God of heaven. Yahweh, the God of heaven, says Cyrus in 1:2. Chapter 5, verse 11, that they send a report to Darius the king. And notice in verse 11, and thus they answered us, saying, we are servants of the God of heaven and earth, and are rebuilding the temple. How did the Gentiles come to call Israel's God the God of heaven? And other times the God of heaven and earth. It's because as Israel has to define their God vis-a-vis the many other gods represented within the Persian Empire, this is the terminology they use. This is how they define him to the Gentiles. He is Yahweh, who happens to be the God in the heavens, who has the God of the heavens, exercises his authority over the earth. We don't have a God who is just a God of a land, even though you'll realize that that is exactly the understanding of Cyrus back in chapter 1, verse 3. He is the God who's in Jerusalem. I mean, all the gods of the peoples I've conquered, they all reside someplace. You know, they're the God of that people, that land. Then Israel's God is Yahweh, who just happens to have a residence in Jerusalem. And that residence has been destroyed. So I, in magnanimity, honoring Yahweh, are giving a decree. I'm giving a decree that Israel can go back, the Jews can go back, and rebuild that house for the God who dwells in Jerusalem. But the God who dwells in Jerusalem is the God of heaven. But we'll see that this understanding for God is already given to us in the book of Daniel. See, when Daniel has to speak to Nebuchadnezzar, the other Gentile, and has to talk about his God, how does he speak about Yahweh? He's the God of heaven and earth. There is a God in heaven who rules over earth, Nebuchadnezzar. He's the one who's given you the dream. All right, and so this nomenclature for God continues on in Ezra and Nehemiah. But understand that in Ezra and Nehemiah, this God that they are speaking about to the Gentiles is Yahweh, and he is sovereign. And notice all of the terminology that is used. It was the hand of God, the good hand of God, that was directing Ezra and directed Nehemiah. The eye of God was watching. The Lord turned the heart. God frustrated. This came from our God. God put it into my heart. And then even the prayer of Nehemiah 3 times in the last chapter, remember me, O God, for good, as you come to the end of the book of Nehemiah. Remember me, O my God, for good. So that certainly this God of heaven, that when you get to Jerusalem is obviously Yahweh, is the same God that we have spoken about throughout the Old Testament. Israel's God, the God of creation, the God of heaven and earth, to find that way to the Gentiles, is the God who is sovereign, the God who is in control. And there is not the subtlety that we've had in Ruth and Esther, so it's more subtle than what we've seen within the Torah and the former prophets. But certainly each one of these statements is reminding us, all right, behind what is taking place is the sovereign Yahweh, the sovereign God. And that is why we have such an emphasis in Ezra and Nehemiah, again, on prayer. God is seen through these two books to consistently respond to the prayers of his people, and predominantly, obviously, of Ezra and Nehemiah themselves. So it's a lot like Ruth. Every prayer that is uttered within the book, God answers. And so there is an emphasis in Ezra and Nehemiah that God responds to the prayers of his godly ones. And he is not a hidden God in that sense, that when he is invoked, he responds. Now also within it, and Ezra begins this way, is that God also is acting in accordance with his prophetic word. So I could put it this way, that within Ezra and Nehemiah, the Spirit-directed author is making it very, very clear that, yes, God is in control of what is taking place. He is the sovereign God, and his sovereignty, if I might put it this way, is being worked out in response to the prophetic word and the prayers of his people. And significantly, as you go through the text, you will note that in the prayers, these are men who know the prophetic word. Ezra and Nehemiah are men of Torah. They know what Yahweh has said. For example, in Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah confesses in verse 7, we've acted very corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember the word which you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you're unfaithful, I will scatter you among the peoples. But if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though those of you who have been scattered were in the most remote part of the heavens, I will gather them from there, will bring them to the place where I have caused my name to dwell, and they are your servants. That is, those who have gone back to Jerusalem, and your people whom you redeem by your great power and by your strong hand. O Adonai, I beseech you, may your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant. All right, as I'm asking for prayer in this case, it's going to be a prayer for the well-being and for the outworking of your plan for those who are back in Jerusalem. And I pray this on the basis of the word that have been given to Moses. Right, and so you can see that even within the prayers, that just as Ezra begins, God is at work in line with what he has promised through the prophets and by the prayers of his people. We will come back to this certainly as you go through the book. You find out the emphasis upon the temple. Obviously, the first 6 chapters of Ezra are all about rebuilding the temple. But then what takes place at the temple continues to come before us as we go through the book. And then very quickly, just to conclude, when you talk about the temple, there is an emphasis upon the law, the keeping of the commandments that God had given. The Levites who minister in the temple are ever before us within the book. We see the sin of the people. We'll come back and talk about that in the flow of the book. And Ezra, in Ezra 10, and then through his teaching and giving the people the word, leading the people to confession in Nehemiah chapter 9 of their sins. So that there is sin and the people confess it at the end of Ezra. There is sin and Nehemiah confesses it in Nehemiah 1. There is sin that Nehemiah deals with in chapter 5. There is the confession of the people in Nehemiah 9. There is further sin of the people in Nehemiah 13, but significantly, there is no repentance on the part of Nehemiah individually for the people or the people. Only Nehemiah praying, remember me, O God, for good.